We're going to spend a little time this evening discussing the Sabbath day. A lot of questions arise about this command that we find primarily in the Old Testament, though there is some reference to it in the New Testament, but a lot of questions remain about what role should it play in the life of the Christian. We see it was an integral part of the nation of Israel, that it was one of their main failings. It is one of the things that God would often list as things that they failed to do as to why he was punishing them when he sent the Syrians or the Babylonians. This was often among things like idolatry and robbing God by not paying their tithes or not offering the best of the best as their sacrifices. He would also say, you have failed to keep the Sabbath. This was to be an integral part of the Old Covenant, but what role does it have in the New Covenant for Christians today? Now in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 12, it says, "Observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath day of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So what role does it play for those who would want to be right with God today? We're going to begin by just observing that as we look in the Old Testament, I think this is critical to understanding the nature of the Sabbath question, and again, what significance does it have in the lives of Christians today, is we need to understand it was a unique command that was particular to the nation of Israel. So it is not only geographically located to one nation, but is also a factor of time. It is really a unique command to one time and place in history. And so it was a special command to the nation of Israel. It identified or helped identify them as God's people, but it really was limited to the nation of Israel. Now, I know you could go back to the very beginning of the Bible, and I would say Genesis covers perhaps 2,000 years or more of human history. And you could go back to the very beginning and find that, God rested on the seventh day. But as far as trying to find an example where this is commanded, I don't think you'll find it until you get to Exodus chapter 16. Go over to Exodus chapter 16. This is really the first mention of the Sabbath day as a commandment upon man. In Exodus chapter 16, you notice in verse 4 that the context here is during the Exodus. This is shortly after the people have left Egypt, and they complain about not having food, and so God gives them food, and then he gives some more regulations. This is the wilderness time frame. This is right around the time that the law was given to the nation of Israel through Moses. In Exodus chapter 16, beginning in verse 4, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my instruction." And so what we see here is this is, again, a way of identifying whether or not they're faithful. And that's why a lot of times through the prophets later in Israel's history, God would challenge them. He said, "This calamity is coming upon you, but just try me. Put me to the test. Just keep my commandments. Just observe the Sabbath and see what will happen if this calamity will be averted." It's kind of funny how the Sabbath became almost representative of obedience to the law as a whole. Because really it's kind of one of the most basic commandments of the law. And it really is almost a litmus test throughout Israel's history that at the times as a nation throughout their history, those periods of time where they kept the Sabbath, they were generally good-natured. They were generally holy people who feared God, and they would keep the other commands. And during those periods of time when they wouldn't keep the Sabbath, they really weren't keeping much of anything else. So the Sabbath almost became, like God says here, it was a test to them. And it almost became throughout their history like a litmus test. That if they would just observe this one commandment, well, that probably would indicate that their heart was mostly in the right place, and they would show some effort in keeping the rest of the commandments. And so he says this will be a test, whether or not they will walk in my instruction. And it will come about on the sixth day when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. And so the idea was, Sunday through Friday, or Sunday through Thursday, it would be normal. Friday, it would be you'd gather a double portion because there wouldn't be anything on the Sabbath. You weren't supposed to gather anything on the Sabbath. And so this was his test. And if we jump down a little bit to verse 22, the commands are simple and straightforward, and they just didn't get it. We like to criticize Adam and Eve for really having one rule, and they couldn't even keep that. But that's just human nature. This rule was very simple, and they just didn't get it. In verse 22 of Exodus 16, now it came about on the sixth day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning. So they put it aside until morning, as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. And Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath day to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. And it came about on the seventh day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And I just think, I have to laugh at how ridiculous this is. Moses says, gather it today, prepare your food for tomorrow. There isn't going to be anything tomorrow. And the next morning they wake up and go out looking, and Moses, where is the food? No wonder Moses wanted God to take his life out of frustration for dealing with these people. Pretty clear instructions, but they just didn't get it. Verse 28, then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you bread for 2 days on the sixth day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. And there we find that this is something that God has given. And we see this trend throughout all the Bible, that when God gives a commandment, it isn't to keep us from something. Like we talked about this morning in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. There are so many people that are afraid to really dive in, to really commit to God, because they're afraid of what it'll cost them. They're afraid that they'll miss out on all kinds of fun things in life, but they don't realize that the commands, yes, God does have expectations of us, but those commands aren't meant to restrict us. They're meant to bless us. They're meant to give us something good if we just trust in God. And so that's why God said to them, again in verse 29, see, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Not that he's binded or bound this commandment on you and burdened you with this, says the Lord has given you the Sabbath. He gives you bread for 2 days on the sixth day. So remain in your place and be at rest. Don't go out and work. And so we find that it's a gift from God, but this really is the first commandment of the Sabbath. Like I said, you might be able to find in Genesis, mentions of God resting on the seventh day, but it was never really a direct command from God until Israel is a nation, and through Moses they are being given a covenant law. It's pretty clear. Moses is explaining this in detail, exactly what is meant by a day of rest. Don't even bother cooking your food the next day. You cook it on the day before the Sabbath. He gives explicit instructions because this had not been commanded prior. If this was already a command from God, Moses wouldn't have needed to give the kinds of details that he did. And even with this explanation, many of the people still violated the first observance of the Sabbath. It should be pretty clear that the people of Israel had not encountered this rule before. So this is its introduction, is in Exodus. It was not a law or commandment of God prior to the law of Moses. So again, it is unique to Israel. It is unique to that nation who is under that covenant delivered by Moses. And thus, when we get to Exodus chapter 20, if you'll turn over to Exodus chapter 20, it's repeated for emphasis as one of the foundational laws of the Ten Commandments. It says in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And so we see a reason for the Sabbath day, why it is the seventh day. It's the precedent that God set in the creation. So our mind is drawn back, and perhaps this tells us and gives us a little insight into what the Sabbath day was all about. You didn't work. It was a cessation from working, but your mind perhaps was supposed to be focused on God, because he says, well, you're to remember the Lord, that he created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So the command to observe the Sabbath is repeated here at the Ten Commandments, not because they had been doing it all their lives, but because it was something that had recently been bound upon them, and they needed this reminder written in stone, because this command was supposed to last as long as this covenant did. So it was written down in stone. Moses clearly stated that this law that we read about in Exodus, that we read about again in Deuteronomy, this law was for the nation of Israel. It wasn't for other people. It wasn't a law that was for other nations. It was a covenant with Israel. Now, people from other nations could become proselytes. They could join themselves to Israel and keep these commandments. But primarily, Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 3, this covenant was for Israel. Therefore, the Sabbath commandment was part of this covenant. It was a commandment that was for Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 3, it says, "The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers." So again, their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were not obligated to keep the Sabbath as a holy day in the same sense that Israel was here. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive. So again, this was something that was unique to Israel, not given to other nations. Consider also Deuteronomy chapter 4. If you go back a chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 4, in verse 7, "For what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day?" Again, the idea is this law was just for the nation of Israel. In Exodus 31, in verse 16, it says, the Sabbath was to be observed throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant, as a reminder that they are the people of God. It is a symbol of this relationship they had with God. So, again, this is something that was unique to Israel. And you just think about the purpose. In Exodus chapter 20 at the Ten Commandments, part of the purpose was to remember that God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. But one other thought, Deuteronomy chapter 5. Look at verse 15. Again, this commandment was unique to Israel, and to prove that, you just consider what significance did it have. It didn't have the same significance for other nations as it did for Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15, it says, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So again, part of the Sabbath was remembering God, was directing your thoughts towards God, stopping all of your work and labors and maybe focusing your thoughts on God that day. Remembering, and so for Israel, the significance of the Sabbath was to remember it was a day of rest, when before they were slaves that had no rest. God gave them this day of rest to remind them of how good he is. He said, you were slaves, and I came and set you free. And so this is a day you're supposed to remember that. You're supposed to honor me and remember that it's much better under my covenant. And that's what Jesus says. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's still a yoke, it's still a burden, but it's much better than trying to carry the weight by yourself. It's much better than the burden Satan will put on your shoulders. And that's what God is saying here. You remember me. You remember the way things used to be. And if you ever think about wanting to go back to Egypt, you just remember you were slaves there. And now you have a day of rest. So it was a privilege for them. Now here's where I might not have the best understanding of this. It's a subject I think I need to study a little further, but what did a Sabbath observance look like? Well, we can understand at least one part clearly, is there was not supposed to be any work at all on the Sabbath. It was a day dedicated to serving God. Look at Psalm 92. In Psalm 92, it's a psalm of praise. It's a rather short psalm, but let's read this. And I want you to notice that at the top, this isn't necessarily original to the text, though it's relatively dependable, these headings or subtitles. Psalm 92, praise for the Lord's goodness, a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. That maybe this was the kind of psalm that they would recite, that they would sing, or that they would read out loud, that they would think upon these things on this Sabbath day. I think it was a day of reflecting upon God. You might say a home devotional. It is good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing praises to thy name, O Most High, to declare thy loving kindness in the morning and thy faithfulness by night, with a 10-stringed lute and with the harp, with resounding music upon the lyre, for thou, O Lord, hast made me glad by what thou hast done. I will sing for joy at the works of thy hands. How great are thy works, O Lord! Thy thoughts are very deep. A senseless man has no knowledge, nor does a stupid man understand this, that when the wicked sprouted up like grass, and all who did iniquity flourished, it was only that they might be destroyed forevermore. But thou, O Lord, art on high forever. For behold thine enemies, O Lord, for behold thine enemies will perish, and all who do iniquity will be scattered. But thou hast exalted my horn like that of a wild ox. I have been anointed with fresh oil, and my eye has looked exultantly upon my foes. My ears hear of the evildoers who rise up against me. The righteous man will flourish like the palm tree. He will grow like a cedar in Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still yield fruit in old age. They will be full of sap and very green, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Again, tradition suggests this was a psalm that was traditionally recited on the Sabbath. And so that's part of what I understand the Sabbath to be. In Isaiah 58, Isaiah 58 maybe gives us a little insight too, but as we're turning to Isaiah 58, I want to suggest, especially to mothers and fathers with children in the home, we ought to take advantage of the times that our children are home and try to spend time together as a family, perhaps doing something other than watching a movie or television. And maybe reading the Bible together, at least for a period of time once a week. Maybe a small devotion with just family in the home with no distractions. I think that might have been the emphasis of what the Sabbath was supposed to represent in the family and home life, and maybe that's something we need to be sure we're incorporating with our families today. In Isaiah 58 and verse 13, if because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure, and speaking your own word, Then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And this just makes it sound like the Sabbath wasn't supposed to be a day for them to indulge in their hobbies or do whatever they wanted. It was a day, I think, focused on remembering God and directing their thoughts towards God and acknowledging Him, praising Him for all the good that He has done. And clearly, it was a day to rest from all labors, as we've read a number of times, and it was pretty clear, men, women, children, animals, servants, you name it, everybody was supposed to stop the work. It may seem normal to us to have a day of rest, but we're used to a 5-day work week. Most people back then basically worked every day, 7 days a week, so they were peculiar among the nations for having a day where everything just stopped. Everything stopped. Even commerce just stopped. Everyone had the day off. Servants, animals. Exodus chapter 16, it says no cooking was to be done. Exodus 35 and verse 3 says not even to start the fire, not even to kindle the fire for cooking food. So really, they were not supposed to do any kind of work at all. Exodus 34, it said even during harvest time, even during planting time, they were to observe the Sabbath. So that would be stopping what would be valuable time for either planting seeds and gathering crops. But even during that time, it didn't matter how much work needed to be done. When the Sabbath came, you stopped what you were doing. Jeremiah chapter 17. In Jeremiah chapter 17, it says, burdens or heavy loads weren't supposed to be carried either. Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 20. And say to them, listen to the word of the Lord, kings of Judah and all inhabitants of Jerusalem who come in through these gates. Thus says the Lord, take heed for yourselves and do not carry any load on the Sabbath day or bring anything in through the gates of Jerusalem. And so it was supposed to be even a day where just commerce came to a halt. And a person violating the day of rest, violating the Sabbath, was to be punished. We have a kind of a harsh story in Numbers chapter 15 of a man carrying a bundle of sticks on the Sabbath, and he is stoned for it. Again, that might seem harsh to us, but was God not clear about this? That's really the other side of the coin. When you think that these punishments are harsh, you just have to say, well, it really wasn't that, confusing of a command to begin with. And so God means it. He's serious about it. And so Nehemiah struggled with this, when he was trying to rebuild the city. They were always bringing stuff in on the Sabbath. They were not stopping from their businesses. They were trying to make money on the Sabbath. And Nehemiah had to work and fight against this. So this was a problem in Israel. And oddly enough, it kind of became the opposite, where, maybe they felt like God put too much of a burden on it, and they just wanted to keep going about their business. They wanted to keep making money on the Sabbath. They wanted to keep the commerce going. They didn't want to stop the harvest. And so maybe, under the Old Testament, they thought God was too restrictive, yet we come full circle. And in the New Testament, you read passages like Matthew chapter 12, where Jesus criticizes them. You couldn't even help a sick person. You just have to let them die on the Sabbath. The Pharisees came and they added so many other traditions and rules to it, and they were pitting one command of God against another. They came down harshly on Jesus' disciples just for having a little snack, picking some heads of grains. That didn't violate the Sabbath, but they declared that it was a violation of the Sabbath. They created so many additional rules to the Sabbath that it became so confusing. But this is a little bit about how the Sabbath was observed. Again, a day of rest, you stop from all work, and perhaps the emphasis was supposed to be on remembering God and honoring Him that day. As Isaiah 58 said, it's not about going and doing the things you like doing. It's not about, I'm going to go drown a couple worms on the Sabbath. I'm not working. I'm just, relaxing and fishing. Well, God says that's not what it's about. It's about remembering me. It's about remembering all the good that I have done for you and how you are richly blessed as a people. And so it was temporary in nature. We know in Jeremiah 31, God says, there's going to come a day when I get rid of this old law, where I'm going to bring in a new covenant. This covenant is going to have forgiveness of sins. And so Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 31, it makes it clear, this was unique to Israel in the sense that it was first commanded by Moses, not before that. And this commandment would go away with the covenant as a whole. Jeremiah 31 and verse 31. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This covenant is going to be new. He says it's not going to be like that one I made with Moses at Mount Sinai with the people of Israel then. I'm going to make a new covenant. So what happens with the old covenant? It goes away. It's not in effect anymore. So the things that are attached to that covenant, they go with it. Well, you might say, well, what about the Ten Commandments? Does that mean, if you throw away the Ten Commandments, it says, thou shalt not murder. Does that mean we can murder now? Well, okay, read the New Covenant, and it says don't murder. But the New Covenant doesn't say anything about keep the Sabbath. So the conclusion is, if this Old Covenant that the Sabbath was pretty clearly attached to, if that covenant is going away, and it did go away when the New Covenant came with Christ, it's not something we're obligated to keep anymore. It's not a commandment we have to observe. God promised to replace that commandment and that covenant. And so in Hebrews chapter 8, we could read really all of chapter 7 through 10 of Hebrews, but just notice these couple of verses. Hebrews chapter 8. In Jeremiah 31, God criticized them for they broke my covenant. I'm going to give a new covenant, not like the one that they broke. They couldn't keep it. Because that old covenant was based upon, we had to keep it perfectly to be saved, and we couldn't. And so Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 6, but now he has obtained a more excellent ministry by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. And so it's clear that that old covenant went away, and we have a new covenant that Christ himself inaugurated. A covenant in which he has made the first obsolete. And he says in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13, what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. When you have a new covenant, the old covenant becomes obsolete and goes away. So it was very temporary in nature. And really, this is kind of our last point we're going to consider is Colossians chapter 2. So when you get asked questions about the Sabbath, what I hope you're able to take away from the lesson this evening is to be able to show people how it started as a commandment with Moses. It wasn't something that mankind has been commanded to do from day one. It started with a commandment from Moses, and it was unique to the nation of Israel, and it was unique to the covenant that was temporary. You'd be able to show people in Jeremiah 31 that covenant was told it had an expiration date. And then in Colossians chapter 2, we understand that really these are all just shadows. The old law was a shadow of something better. Colossians chapter 2, if we start in verse 11, and in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. And when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, and which was hostile to us. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Again, that covenant is taken out of the way. It is not in effect. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Now notice here these last two verses we're going to read. Verse 16, therefore let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. Things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. The Sabbath is included with other things like animal sacrifices, like circumcision, that are just a shadow that were designed to go away but be replaced by a permanent reality. The Sabbath was not meant to be a permanent command throughout the entire history of this planet. It was something unique to Israel. It was a shadow, but we have something more permanent now. And what is that? According to Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 9, it says, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. It is not a weekly Sabbath like the nation of Israel had, but is something that yet awaits us. It is a promise of a more permanent and more perfect rest than the Sabbath day or the land of Canaan was for Israel. And so what a wonderful promise. And it's very much like, the blood of bulls and goats, the animal sacrifices. It was a shadow of the more perfect sacrifice in Christ. They had yearly and just daily animal sacrifices, constant, replaced by one perfect sacrifice. They had a weekly rest that was a shadow of the one perfect rest that waits the faithful child of God. So I want to offer this as a convenient opportunity. If you've heard the message, if you understand that Christ came and he established a new covenant, and he made it clear that those who believe, who repent of their sins, who obey the command to be baptized, to be washed clean by his blood, which inaugurated this new covenant, you can have this hope of a Sabbath rest, a permanent rest, a perfect rest, forever in the presence of God. If that's the hope you want, won't you give your life to Christ this night? Please come forward now as we stand and sing.